Please allow me to introduce the chair. The chair is Professor Sun Sun Lim. She was a very dear colleague and mentor when I was doing my PhD studies in the Department of Communications and New Media in the National University of Singapore, and she is still a very good colleague of mine. So Sun Sun is Professor of Media and Communication, as well as the head of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. Sun Sun's research interests are in the area of media use among youths and families, and her more recent work focuses on youths at risk, migrants and international students. So welcome Sun Sun and the speakers.
Thank you, Carol, for the very kind introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And also, I'd like to congratulate Carol and the rest of the IPS team for this really wonderful event. So we've had a really riveting morning looking at issues of fake news, particularly from not just a historical perspective, but also looking at pressures on the industry. In this particular panel, we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at that one uncle whom you have in your WhatsApp group, the one who's always the first to send you WhatsApp messages about radioactive sushi or toothpaste tubes that will explode in your face. Those kinds of uncles or distant cousins whom you have, we're curious to understand really the psychology behind the individual user, the individual consumer. What is it that motivates and propels people to actually spread misinformation? Why are some people much more vulnerable to misinformation than others? So we've got a very exciting lineup of speakers today, and the first speaker is a cognitive psychologist studying memory and reasoning at the University of Western Australia's School of Psychological Science. And I will try to pronounce his name in the proper German way, although I might sound fake. But his name is Professor Ullrich Becker from the University of Western Australia, and he's actually done lots of research on misinformation, and he's recognized internationally as an expert on the effects of misinformation on people's reasoning and decision making. So Ullrich is going to be speaking about issues of why it is people are particularly vulnerable, what kinds of factors make people more prone to falling for fake news. And so I present to you Professor Ecker, who is going to speak on the psychology of misinformation.
Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for having me. I'm a bit worried now that I won't be talking about radioactive sushi. I'm very sorry. That would have been awesome. But anyhow, here's the clicker. So I'm here today to talk about the psychology of misinformation. And I'll give you my take-home message right away on slide 1 because I know you're still paying attention. So my research looks at ways in which misinformation influences people's memory, their reasoning, and their decision-making, even after they've received credible corrections. And the kicker is that people do this even when they understand the correction, they believe the correction, they later on remember the correction. Even in those circumstances, their decision-making, their reasoning will be affected by that misinformation. So, for example, if you hear that vaccines cause autism and then you learn that it's not true, we can still measure the impact of that misinformation on your decision-making. And that's a reasonably scary and sobering thought, I think. Where does misinformation come from? I think you're more the experts than I am here. Obviously, the media can contribute to this. The media landscape has changed a fair bit. There's now arguably less fact-checking and an obsession in some segments of the media with balanced coverage, even in the absence of balanced evidence. And a second obvious source is social media, where there's no fact-checking and people really use the potential of information to elicit an emotional response in the recipient rather than the information's veracity. And there's all these echo chambers and filter bubbles that if you like some misinformation online, you will just get more and more and more of it. It would be very naive to assume, and this has been also mentioned before, that misinformation can of course also be disseminated on purpose. There's buzzwords like cognitive warfare, which basically means the very targeted identification of vulnerable people and then the dissemination of propaganda and disinformation to those people. Arguably, this was very important in the US election process. But turning to the psychology, why do people believe in misinformation? Well, first of all, we need to understand that people want to understand what's going on in the world. They want to understand causalities, in particular if there's unusual or negative events. For example, if your child is diagnosed with autism, you want to know what's going on. And that's a good thing, because if you understand why something happens, you can avoid it happening again, obviously. But the problem arises if there is no good explanation. That opens the door to all kinds of misinformation. For example, if you don't know why a plane disappears, there's all kinds of misinformation and conspiracy theories that will pop up straight away. In other words, people want to build mental models of the world because we think inside our heads, the world is mainly outside of our heads. We need to build mental models of the world, but they want these mental models to be complete. They want to understand what's going on. They don't like incomplete models, and they're willing to accept information that is maybe not very reliable or valid if that allows them to build complete models of the world so they have a complete understanding. We also need to acknowledge that people are faced with a deluge of information nowadays. They don't have the resources in terms of time, motivation, cognitive resources, access to high-quality information to process all that information in a sense that it's impossible for people to thoroughly and objectively evaluate the evidence that is out there. What people do in this situation is, of course, they turn to mental rules of thumb, to heuristics, where they encounter a piece of information, they ask themselves, how does this fit in with what I already believe? How does this fit in with what I think I know? How does it fit in with what other people believe? In particular, trusted other people. And expertise may not be a really relevant factor here. We have some research here that it's really whether or not you trust the source. Whether it's your Uncle Bob or your GP, the expertise doesn't seem to really matter as long as you trust the person. And that's something that's really important to understand. This creates a problem, however. I mean, usually heuristics work, but it creates a problem if what you believe, what others believe is wrong. Then these heuristics open you up to biases, open you up to those confirmation biases. You're out there looking to just confirm what you already know or what you already believe. Now, people have argued that there's a reasonably simple solution to this. We just need to identify people's misconceptions and then give them the accurate facts. This is known as the information deficit model, and this is just known not to work. And this is going back to my take-home message, namely that once people have processed a piece of information that seems sort of vaguely, credible to them, it's just not possible to take it back. Retractions of misinformation are notoriously ineffective. How do we study this in the lab? I'll just give you a brief example. We use anything from real-world political misinformation, things that Donald Trump has said, or real-world misconceptions, all the way to sort of fictional stories that we tell people in the lab. And this is a fictional story. We give people a report about a spike in seizures recorded in a certain hospital, and we argue that it's caused by a new vaccine. And then some people, but not others, receive a retraction of this, saying, okay, we've reviewed the evidence and we conclude that actually there's no link between the two. And then we measure people's memory, their inferential reasoning, their behavioral intentions, their behavioral choices. And the typical pattern looks a bit like this. What I'm plotting here is the number of times people refer to that piece of critical information, the vaccine causing the seizures, in response to our questions. Now, the scale is arbitrary. Let's say we've asked them 10 questions, and they refer to the misinformation roughly 4 times, right? Now, this isn't a case where it's not retracted. They just learn that the seizures are caused by the vaccine, that's it. They might refer to the vaccines 4 times. Now, if we tell them that it's not true, if we retract that, obviously the number of references goes down, but it doesn't go anywhere near 0. Roughly, it is half. That's what we typically find. And that's what I mean by post-retraction reliance on misinformation. The effect doesn't go away. People continue to refer to something that they actually know to be retracted. And they do this even if they can demonstrably recall the retraction if we ask them. And in situations such as this entirely fictional story, they have no motivation to believe one version or the other. Obviously, motivation kicks in with real-world materials, and I'll address that in a minute. But it's important to know and to understand that this effect happens even if people have no motivation whatsoever. A purely cognitive effect at this stage. To understand this, it's useful to think of it this way, that people build these models of the world. They want them to be complete. If you have a retraction that kicks out one of a critical piece of information, what that leaves is a gap in people's understanding, a gap in their model, right? And people don't like these gaps. Now, of course, if we retract something, we don't have a magical eraser that will just wipe the information out of memory. It's still there, and people will use it if it's the only thing they have, and even if they know that it's not true. And it seems irrational, but that's what people do. They will get back to that misinformation, put it back into their model, and use it in their reasoning. So the best thing to do is to give people a plausible alternative explanation to fill that gap, right? If you, for example, tell people, okay, the vaccine was not related to the seizures, but the seizures were related to a virus, then they can replace the seizures with a virus. They have an alternative piece of information that they can put into their model. They no longer have the need to rely on the retracted misinformation. And if you do this, then the references to misinformation go down. They don't go to zero. They never go down to zero. You can hit people on the head with a hammer. They don't go down to zero. But they go reasonably close. So giving people an alternative explanation is a really, really important and good thing to do. It seems fairly obvious. But there's also an obvious problem, namely if you don't have such a good alternative explanation, then you have nothing to fill that gap with. Or you might have a factual alternative that is very, very complicated, and it's difficult to explain, difficult for people to understand. They might be drawn towards the more simple myth that they originally held. Or they might be motivated to reject your explanation because they don't like it. It's inconvenient, it doesn't fit with their attitudes and worldviews, and I'll get back to that in a second. So retractions are ineffective, and that's bad news, but it can get worse. There can be situations where retractions are entirely ineffective. It can be situations where retractions can ironically even backfire and increase the very misconceptions that you're trying to correct. I'll talk about two of these effects. They're rare, they don't happen all the time, but they can happen, and I would like to point them out. The worldview backfire effect I've already alluded to. This is where people's motivations kick in, but I first want to say a few words about the familiarity backfire effect. Now, usually in order to refute a myth, a misconception, you need to repeat it, right? For me to tell you that vaccines don't cause autism, I kind of have to repeat the association between the vaccines and the autism, right? I kind of have to repeat that. And that's fine. You want your refutations to be salient and clear, so you need to repeat the misinformation in order to refute it. And we've done some research that finds generally this is actually a safe thing to do. You can repeat it once in order to refute it. However, do not repeat the myth more than necessary. Right? There's some corrections out there that repeat the misinformation over and over again. What that can do is make the myth more familiar in people's minds, and weeks later they will walk away saying, yeah, they told me something about vaccines and autism, right? And that can actually lead to them believing the myth more, and those refutations can backfire. Secondly, don't start with the myth. Lots of these facts versus myths flyers and debunkings online, they start with the myth statement. They say something like, oh, the side effects of the flu vaccine are worse than the flu. That's false. So they present a statement, people read it, they might believe it, and then they're told that it's false. They have to go back, backtrack, and revise their understanding. And that's really not a clever way to do it. So it's much better to start with the facts, or at least warn people that what you're about to tell them is false, and then focus as much as possible on the facts rather than the myths. Here's an example from the real world where this is violated. Trump, a year or two ago, retweeted this entirely false statistic, claiming that of the white homicide victims in the US, 81% are killed by black people, with the source, the Crime Statistics Bureau of San Francisco. Now let's look at this. It's been retweeted massively, usually along with comments that this is racist and ignorant and wrong, but repeating and spreading the misinformation as you go, as they went along. Even PolitiFact, who does a lot of great fact-checking, right? They say they share the facts, but actually they're repeating the myth. Yes, it gets the pants on fire, and that's funny and whatever, but you know, they're actually spreading the misinformation. Here's some real data. White people are mainly killed by white people, black people are mainly killed by black people. That's because murder victims typically know their killers. White people happen to know more white people, black people happen to know more black people, really nothing to see here. Also, the original image that got retweeted was traced back to a neo-Nazi Twitter stream, and that Crime Statistics Bureau doesn't actually exist. Okay, so good evidence that this is wrong. Now, what should have PolitiFact have done? Well, instead of repeating the misinformation, I argue what they should have done, say, Trump spreads fake statistic from Nazi source. It's a myth that blacks kill 81% of white murder victims. The fact is it's only 15%. This is an FBI statistic. Here are the data. And what this does is it explains to people why the myth is wrong. It explains to them where the myth comes from. It explains, hey, there's a myth that's about to follow. It warns people so they're on guard when they receive the misinformation. It repeats the myth, so in order to refute it, then refutes it with a factual statement, with a credible fact source, supported by some data, and then you can add your funny little pants on fire thing, right? So this is what arguably PolitiFact should do, or all the other fact checkers should do, from a psychological point of view. So try and flag myths before you repeat them. Don't repeat them more than necessary. Focus on the facts. That's sort of the take-home message of that. The second backfire effect that I just briefly mentioned is this worldview backfire effect, where if people have strong attitudes and beliefs, they will readily accept misinformation that is congruent with their attitudes. They will defend their beliefs. They will counter-argue inconvenient corrections. And in those cases, retractions can sometimes cause stronger misbelief, ironically. We have some evidence that this happens in particular on people on the right wing of politics, conservative people, but that's still ongoing research. There's not a whole lot you can do about this, except accepting this is how humans work. They're out there trying to confirm their beliefs, but sometimes you can frame your messages so people can actually have an easier time digesting it. So it's always worthwhile considering where does the recipient of this information actually come from? Where can I pick them up? For example, conservatives are more likely to accept climate science if you can frame policy changes as business opportunities, for example, for the nuclear energy industry, rather than government regulation. Okay? That makes people a lot more open-minded. Also, you can use as much as possible graphical retractions or data that is very hard to counter-argue. It's easy to counter-argue things like, the planet is warming, right? You can counter-argue that. It's a vague verbal statement. But if you show several data sources all showing the same trajectory of temperature change with a specified time and a specified degree of change, it's a lot harder to counter-argue that. People still do it, but it's a lot harder. We do need to acknowledge that strong believers will never be persuaded, even with hard evidence, so your efforts are always best targeted towards the undecided majority. And if you do need to deal with people denying evidence, stay calm, focus on the evidence, and remember it's about onlookers. It's about people in the background reading what you're writing or listening to what you're saying. I have a colleague who works in climate science, and I always admire how calm he stays when he's confronted by a climate change denier, denying the evidence, and he just stays calm, he points to the evidence, and he says, it's not about that person. I am not going to change that person's mind. It's about the other people listening. All right, so that's, I think, something worthwhile taking into account. So target the majority, align your correction to the recipient, and use specific graphs when you can. That's pretty much what I wanted to say, but it's hard to not have a final slide where I address this sort of post-truth era. Now, people wonder, why do people like Trump? Not just Trump, but people like Trump. Why do they lie so much? And people say, well, he's just a notorious liar. Or they say things like, well, he's probably believing the things he's saying. Or they say, well, he probably thinks people believe him. And I think that's all nonsense. These people know very well that repeating disinformation is persuasive. They know that it works. They know that if they're doing something here that they don't want people to pay attention to, they can have a shiny lie that people will pay attention to and distract their attention away from the important stuff that they're actually doing in darkness. They also know that bombarding people with non-stop propaganda or telling people that things are unknowable will confuse them, overwhelm them, fatigue them, and ultimately disengage them. That's what they want, right? They want people to be disengaged and just leave them to do what they want to do. So don't fall into those traps. They can also get away with it. We just ran a study on Trump where we show that people's misconceptions can be reduced to fact-checking, but it's harder to make people change their feelings toward the candidate or to change their voting intentions. This is not my quote, but we need to acknowledge that if there's a constant bombardment of a firehose of falsehood, as it's been called, we can't always just run after it and do all the fact-checking and just rely on that. Sometimes we need to step back and expose the manipulation, the hidden agenda, rather than attacking each individual falsehood. And this can help as a pre-bunking tool to inoculate people. We have some research with John Cook and I and Sander van der Linden who looks at the effects of that, if you're interested. We need to invest in education to make sure the next generation knows how to deal with misinformation online. We need to find techno-psychological solutions. We talked about this earlier today. Anything from automated fact-checking to revised algorithms to break those filter bubbles and echo chambers. We need to acknowledge and address societal factors that contribute to this, anything from inequality to the fractionation of the media landscape. So it is a huge problem, but it's a problem that will require a huge amount of interdisciplinary work. I thank you very much.
So thank you, Ullrich, for that wonderful macro perspective, and also for providing some very nifty heuristics that we can use and practice in terms of trying to stamp out fake news. So now that we've had the big picture, we're going to have in our next two speakers present to us experiences drawn from specific populations. And the next speaker is Professor Shyam Tekwani, who is at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu. And he's had nearly 20 years of research and teaching experience in the subject areas of terrorism or political violence and Asian security relations. Now, Professor Tekwani is going to be speaking about the dangers of social media wars. Specifically, he's going to examine the socio-cultural, psychological, and political factors that influence the rising phenomenon of the production of misinformation in Kashmir.
Thank you, Sun Sun, for the introduction, and AJF for offering me this invitation to be here. Before I begin, I have a caveat which I always have to announce. Everything you hear in this room are my views. They do not represent the views of the United States government, nor do they represent the views of the organization I work for, the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, which is a US Department of Defense organization. So this is me speaking, not a US representative or a defense employee, okay? All right. I'm going to look at this primarily through the prism of insurgencies, war, and terrorism, which is what my basic area of study is. And I look at media primarily from my own experience of having been a journalist in my previous avatar covering insurgencies and conflict in South Asia, largely on the Indian subcontinent. All right, okay. It's a truism for most of us who do media studies that terrorism is all about communication. The idea is you want to communicate how violent and how dangerous you can be. You want to spread terror, and the resultant effect, intended effect is for the masses to put pressure on their governments to tackle the issue. So the famous Mrs. Margaret Thatcher's statement, which is publicity is the oxygen of terrorism, essentially underlines the truism that terrorism is about communication. And I just mentioned this to you as a graphic. Terror organizations use media to create irrational anxiety, which effectively pressurizes government to give in to their political demands. That, in a sense, is the idea of communicating terror. Apart from that, what are the other aspects of media use that are involved with terrorists? They range from propaganda, agenda setting, winning popular support, recruitment, fundraising. Now, if you look at this laundry list of goals which terrorists have or insurgents have in the use of media, how different are they from the state's objectives in using media? Are they any different? Do you think they're any different? Well, think about it, but here's the point I'm making. Whether it's the bad guys using media or the good guys using media, they both have the same objectives. Essentially influence certain people to believe what their party line is, if you want to call it that, and all the others that go with it. The former president was very candid in saying, speaking about the power of repetition, the idea was to catapult the propaganda. Of course, from his perspective, it was good propaganda. From the other side's perspective, it was bad propaganda, vice versa. So the large point I want to make here is media is an integral part of the political architecture of security. Now, whether it's war, whether it is counterinsurgency, whether it's counterterrorism, whether it is hyping up a nation to prepare for war, whether it's jingoism, media is a very central factor. And again, another truism, the first casualty of war is truth. If some of you recall the infamous 5 o'clock follies during the Vietnam War, where the military had press conferences exactly at 5 o'clock to announce daily reports on how successful they were in vanquishing and controlling the Viet Cong, when the truth was otherwise. In my own experience, when I was covering the conflict in northeastern Sri Lanka, we had the Indian peacekeeping forces who had these press conferences exactly at 5 p.m. in the evening, telling us how many terrorists they had killed, how many towns and villages they had captured, when the truth was contrary. When I went to visit these places as an embed with the Tamil Tigers, everything that one read and heard about what the military was telling you, or even the government spokesperson was telling you, was actually contrary to the reality. So the point is, again, each side wants to maintain its influence, each side wants to maintain its support, making sure that they appear as the victors, largely. And again, the first casualty is truth in any kind of conflict. All right, so I'm going to dive into a country which I'm somewhat familiar with, a country called India. And we're going to look at some of the things that are occurring there as we speak, particularly in the last 3 years. We're seeing a proliferation of fake news. We're seeing a proliferation of disinformation. And it's not coming merely from supporters or even sympathizers of the ruling party. It's coming from the head of state. It's coming from the head of state's party. It's coming from the government. And the idea here is to fuel nationalism. If Trump can talk about America first, the Indian Prime Minister talks about India first. And in that context, I'm viewing this whole business of fake news in India as a kind of a war scenario. It's a war unleashed by the state against the enemy. And the enemy in this case is a minority, the Muslims. And we're looking at the second largest population of Muslims in the world after Indonesia. Tomorrow it could be Pakistan. The numbers keep varying, 2 and 3, who takes the second position. But the point is, the way I see it, it's war. It's all-out war. And the tools of the trade right now are not just the media, where you're looking at a tremendous amount of Islamophobia and jingoistic kind of nationalism, but it's also followed by physical attacks. Those of you who follow what's happening in India, you probably read about the lynchings, where people are lynched for eating beef or trading in cows or even indulging in the $4 billion leather industry. And guess what's common with all these three? They're all Muslims. The leather industry is run by Muslims. People who tend to eat beef, Hindus don't eat beef because cows are holy cow. It's the Muslims who eat beef. People who trade in beef and leather are Muslims. So it's not just disinformation and fake news, but also physical attacks. So the idea is to glorify the country, bash its critics, in this case, bash its enemy. And so this forms a core of the Hindu nationalist agenda. I spoke to you about, I'll dip into the socio-cultural atmosphere. We're looking at a prime minister of the country who came to power, and this was his slogan: I'm patriot, I'm nationalist, I'm born Hindu. So nationalism is associated directly with the religion in this case. Now, mind you, he comes from a party which has a long history of targeting the minorities. Who assassinated Gandhi? It wasn't a Muslim fanatic. It was a Hindu fanatic who sprung from a Hindu cultural organization, which is an umbrella organization which begot us, our prime minister today. And if you look at what happened almost 4 decades later, the picture on top, it's a destruction of a 16th century mosque by rampaging Hindu mobs. And what was the rationale? The rationale was sitting right or buried right below that 16th century mosque was the birthplace of a Hindu god born probably 5 million years ago. So the idea was destroy the mosque and build a Hindu temple. And if you look at the second slide at the bottom, where 1,044 people were killed, this was a decade after the destruction of the mosque. which was in a place called Godhra in the western part of India in a state called Gujarat, where it was, I would go to the extent of saying state-sponsored, but there was clearly tacit, it seemed obvious that there was tacit approval of an attack against the minority Muslims based on no evidence that a train carriage was set on fire by Muslims to kill Hindu pilgrims returning from a pilgrimage. This was in 2002. And the man there who's looking at you, the hero of hatred, is the current Prime Minister of India. So the point here is you have a long history of an anti-minority worldview, an anti-minority state government which actually vigorously pursued anti-minority policies and now becomes the head of state. And so that's the background to a lot of disinformation and fake news you see going on right now in India. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. A couple of months ago, there's a channel called Times Now, a television channel. It reported that there were rate cards actually being circulated in the southern state of Kerala, which offered rewards of $10,000 for converting Hindus to Islam. And of course, they cleverly tied it to the emergence of the Islamic State. So they were linking it directly to terrorism. Again, this was based on a tweet which came from one of the Hindu supporters, caught fire, it circulated, and it became a core belief, at least among the believers. The reason is most of these fake stories go viral because the Prime Minister, who's very popular, also has he also has a huge Twitter following, probably the second largest as a world leader after Mr. Trump. And then you have mainstream media which basically reaffirm and recirculate these Hindu nationalist agenda stories, okay? Point to remember, fake news is nothing new. The technology has aggravated it, at least clearly in the Indian scenario. We've been hearing fake news against the minorities over years, even during the years when I worked as a journalist, but now it's aggravated. He prides himself for the largest media social presence. And here's another important fact. The way that these fake news stories gain credence is because some of these tweeters who are circulating fake news are followed by the Prime Minister himself. He's on their feed. So just the very fact that he follows them lends those stories an air of credibility and importance. This slide, this just came out this morning. Sherian referred yesterday to Love Jihad. I just want to show you this slide. There's a news channel called The Republic. It's actually an inappropriate name for those of us in the know. It's India's answer to Fox News. We call it Hyena News. And the point here is, the important point, the Supreme Court of India, which has always been inclined to support intercaste, interreligious marriages in the past, actually, based on a complaint by a right-wing supporter, charged the National Investigation Agency of India. Now, the National Investigation Agency was set up in the aftermath of the Mumbai attacks in 2008. Their job is to prevent terrorism. But here's the Supreme Court of India directing the National Intelligence Agency to investigate a case where a Hindu girl converted to Islam and married a Muslim boy in Kerala. And this morning, the NIA has reported that there is a pattern to convert Hindu girls and get them married to Muslim women. Now, this is India's premier anti-terrorism agency following the orders of India's premier judiciary, which is the Supreme Court of India. Unimaginable in the past. Now, whether it is because of the government we have today, it's for us to connect the dots as of now. But this was this morning's news here. A quick touch on Kashmir, which is what basically I want to talk about. For those of you who are not in the know, it's a little province wedged between India and Pakistan. And they've been disputing over this piece of territory for the last 70 years since independence. There is also a small portion ceded to China by Pakistan in the 50s. The situation here is Kashmir is largely Muslim. The population is Muslim. And because of a long-running insurgency since the 80s, over 3 decades of insurgency, the government of India has, let's say, stepped up its efforts, this present government, to, in their words, to bring it into the mainstream. And what does it mean to bring it into the mainstream? When Kashmir became controversial in 1947, the deal was Kashmir would retain a degree of autonomy, unlike the rest of India. So they could have their own governance, they would have their own laws, and so on and so forth. But today, the idea is we're going to remove all that special status. You're going to become a part of us, number one. Number two, the more important factor is they're treating the whole issue as a terrorist issue, not as a separatist issue. The Kashmiris want to be not a part of India, neither a part of Pakistan. They're looking for independence. They're tired of both claiming ownership over them. But we're witnessing in the last, I would say 5 months particularly, actually 5 months plus, an intense effort by the government in India to mark them all as a bunch of terrorists. So there's very little room for negotiations. The army is there in full swing. But more important for us is the fact that the government decided to shut down media sites, access to social media, as well as the internet. And we conducted a field trip. When I say we, it was Dr. Ang Pengwa from the School of Communication, NTU, and I. We went to Kashmir just when the ban was announced. It was a 1-month-long ban. And we discovered a few things, and I'll quickly tell you that. I'm going to take 2 minutes more than I was allotted. But here's an example again. Some of you may have heard of Arundhati Roy, a writer who won a Booker Prize for a book, and she's just come out with another great book. She's done a fair amount of work in Kashmir and among the disenfranchised in India, including the Naxalites. And she was attacked by the right-wingers, basically saying that she had given an interview to a Pakistani website decrying India's army, and so on and so forth, which was all fake news. It was put out by a fake news channel on the internet. And the interesting thing is it was Indian politicians who actually retweeted this and suggested that she should be tied to the jeep. The picture below shows you a picture of the Indian Army during elections last year, and early this year, where they actually tied up a Kashmiri voter to the jeep and drove him through town for a few miles. And so when there was a big huge hue and cry about this, so here they were targeting her that she should be subject to the same treatment. And so there was attack on anybody who spoke up for the issue in Kashmir. They were trolled. They were also there were attempts to discredit their credence, basically. All right, quick 2 slides here. What did we find here? What if we cut the internet in response to fake news? We found 2 things. All deprivation of media leads to anxiety, especially in a war zone, especially in a zone that has been under barrage for 3 decades. Okay, there was the other factor we found was we looked for medical evidence of anxiety, but it was tricky for 2 reasons. One is we couldn't find increased anxiety because this was confounded with the security situation. I mean, those of you who study psychology clearly know the kind of trauma people experience when they're exposed to long-term conflict conditions. The third was because of propaganda from both Pakistan and India, traditional media is distrusted. The older people listen to radios, but the younger generation tend to trust social media. And again, because of the experience with propaganda, most of the people we met, and I'm speaking when I say people, the younger generation, they seem to be tuned to differentiating fake news because there were local web portals set up in Kashmir who had actually acquired a kind of a degree of credibility which well-established old newspapers would envy. So even these were shut down. And when that was shut down, rumors were rampant. It was very difficult for them to sift rumor from fact, the very fact that there were local news websites which were shut down. All right? And finally, the experience is that having the internet helps quell rumors in a situation like Kashmir, in a war zone. And the disruption in the internet is making things for Kashmiris, difficult for Kashmiris and making the situation worse. And there are many ways it's making worse. For number one, the lack of education. Number two, you have a large youth population who are going to be unemployed without education and so on and so forth. I can take that during the Q&A. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Shyam. So thank you for that interesting presentation that really provides us with nice food for thought, and particularly also a comparative perspective with Edson's presentation. And our next speaker is Dr. Edson Tandoc, who's a very welcome addition to our academic community in Singapore. He's very young and energetic and doing all sorts of exciting work on the sociology of message construction. He is assistant professor at the Wee Kim Wee School of Communication and Information at the Nanyang Technological University. Now, Edson is going to answer the question why fake news might be good for journalism. And to do that, he's going to share with us his findings on a study of Singaporean media consumers and delve into the question of the processes behind how social media users authenticate information that they see on social media. So, Edson, please.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm very happy and excited to be here and be part of the Asia Journalism Forum. Also, two of my former professors are here. I was a student of Professor Cherian George, who gave last night's keynote. I missed it, but I watched it on Facebook. I had class last night. Already watched it on Facebook. Also, one of my favorite teachers from undergrad in the Philippines, Professor Yvonne Chu, is here. So this will be both exciting and probably terrifying for me presenting today. We've had great discussions so far, great presentations so far. What I can add will be to provide you with findings from a series of surveys that we've done at NTU here in Singapore. So to the journalists who are here today, I'll be giving you something that you love dealing with, numbers and statistics. So let's start. Just a brief context to the media system in Singapore. So Singapore is one of the most wired nations, and internet penetration, social media penetration rate, both are very high in here. Social media penetration rate in Singapore is third highest worldwide at about 77% of the population, just next to UAE with 99% and South Korea with 83%. And so that sets the context to understanding how fake news spreads in this country. So looking at social media use in Singapore, this is based on a survey we've done in July this year, where we asked how often users use each of the following social media platforms. We see that WhatsApp is the most common, most frequently used in a scale of 1 to 5, followed by YouTube and Facebook. So again, what we're seeing here is we can classify social media platforms in terms of closed apps, those that you can send a message to a group, but at the same time you can also send a message to just one person. So that's the communication is invisible to any third-party user. But we can also look at Facebook, which is an open platform where whatever you post or comments you post on someone else's page can be visible to a third party. In terms of what people use on social media, so it's not just about the number of users that make social media something very important to look at, but also the amount of time that people actually spend on social media, and also the things that they do there. So I asked them to rate their frequency of using each of these different types of uses of social media, ranging from playing a game to sending a friend request, writing a status update. If you look at the most frequently used uses of Facebook, it's viewing someone's photo or watching a video or reading news articles or reading the news feed. So we're seeing that for most people, Facebook is now a platform where they actually view content. So it's more of receiving or being exposed to content rather than actually using it to produce our own content. And that, I think, has important implications when we looked at how people then consume their news. And indeed, in an earlier survey that I did, where I asked people where they get their news from, so how often they actually use each of these sources of news. Facebook is now the most used source of news, at least in Singapore, based on this survey that I did in October 2016. Already displacing newspaper websites, which 2 years ago when I did a similar survey, newspaper websites were still the most used source of news. 2 years later, but again, this is a survey of Facebook users. 2 years later, Facebook is now the most commonly used news source. So, journalists have responded to that, right? And we've opened Twitter accounts, and Straits Times here is very active on Facebook. And so social media have facilitated the spread of news. If we use it now to distribute information that's related to news, but it has also facilitated the spread of fake news. You've probably recognized this, something that went viral, I think, last year, a photo that purportedly shows the roof of Punggol Waterway Terraces caving in. In the afternoon, the police actually sent a team to respond to that, and it was actually fake. You probably receive a WhatsApp message on fake rice from NTUC Fair Price, who were actually buy my rice. We also saw this misappropriated headline that President Tan invites the Thailand's new king to eat at KFC. Well, I think KFC has decent fried chicken, but still, this was a fake headline. This is not the actual headline. It's an actual Facebook post by Straits Times, but someone changed the headline. And also this went viral. And one of my most favorite fake news stories from the Philippines, where someone claimed that NASA hailed our president as the best president in the solar system, which I think is pretty cool. Also in the United States, of course, during the American presidential elections, a lot of fake news stories that were about politics actually got a lot of engagement. And later I'll show that engagement of fake stories were actually more than engagement with real stories, at least during the American elections. So, brief definition of what is fake news. This is a definition that I use. It's news articles that are intentionally and verifiably false and could mislead readers. So in the literature, people have already identified two main motivations why people produce and spread fake news. One's financial. We've heard of the Macedonia kids, right, who've made so much money spreading fake news. There was one author of fake news interviewed by Washington Post who claimed he earned $10,000 for a month just producing fake news. And when I was in the conference in Chicago, Craig Silverman from BuzzFeed also shared how he also interviewed people who actually produce fake news that are both against Republicans and also against Democrats. So they're producing the same fake news content, but for different persuasions, because the only goal is to get those clicks. So you're already capturing the market for the really ardent Republicans, but you're also capturing the market for some Democrats who would believe in fake news. So it's all about getting the clicks and then getting ad revenues from Google AdSense, which actually does not distinguish between whether a website is spreading real news or just spreading fake news. And the second motivation is ideological, as what we've seen from the previous presentations, where the goal is actually to persuade people about a particular ideology. All right, in Singapore, I've also asked this question in one of the surveys that I've done in terms of how often do people come across false news on social media. So 2.2% said never, and then we see 58.8% said sometimes, 18% said frequently, 3.7% said very frequently. Again, the disclaimer for this question is these are people who realize that they saw false news. Right? So it's just the tip of the iceberg. But still, it's 21.7% saying they've come across false news on social media frequently to very frequently. In another survey, I asked a different question. I asked them to rate their agreement with this statement I believed information from social media that turned out to be false. And we see that 12.7% said often and 5.5% said very often. So again, there's about 18.2% saying very often to often that they've believed information from social media that turned out to be false. And again, these are just people who were able to realize that they actually believed in fake news. Again, just the tip of the iceberg. In terms of predicting the frequency of seeing false news on social media, age is a negative predictor, meaning younger people tend to report that they see more false news more often. Those who consume their news primarily through tablets and phones, mobile phones, they also reported seeing false news more often, and also those who consume their news primarily through Twitter and Facebook. Now, in terms of predicting those who believed in something that turned out to be false on social media, education is a negative predictor, meaning those who have higher educational attainment, they reported less frequency of believing in something that turned out to be false. In terms of social media use, Facebook and WhatsApp are also significant predictors, as well as Google Plus and Tinder. Tinder I understand because it's probably they're referring to fake profiles. You know, they swipe on something and then they meet that person, it turns out a fake person. But Google Plus, I have no explanation, and maybe it's something that we can discuss after. Now, what do users do with fake news? There's also one question that we asked in a survey we did in December 2016. We gave them different types of actions that you can take when you encounter fake news. 6.5% said, I post a correction on my own social media account. Messaging the person who posted to say it was wrong, 11.4%. Posting a comment saying the post was wrong, 12.1%. Unfollowing or blocking the person who posted the wrong information, 12.1%. Reporting the post so it gets removed, and I've done this to my math teacher, 12.2%. Ignoring the wrong post, 73%. So I feel like part of the problem that allows fake news to spread on social media is that when we see one, most of us don't really do anything. And I think that's part of the problem. Now, based on the survey we've done, we've also tried to map out a framework to describe how users authenticate information they see on social media. So we distinguish between internal acts and external acts of verification. So internal acts of verification refer to the the initial interaction between the message and the user. And people look at themselves, their own wisdom, gut, or stock knowledge. They look at the source. Is it from Straits Times? Is it from a credible source? They look at the message. They check the tone. Does this make sense? Is it too polemical? They look at message cues. How many people have liked it? Right? Now, if the internal acts of verification are insufficient, people then move to external acts of verification, which we call the 4 I's. It can be interpersonal or institutional. It can be incidental or intentional. So an example of an interpersonal and incidental act of external verification would be just waiting what others would say. So through the words of mouths of their friends and relatives. Interpersonal and intentional would be someone said he or she would WhatsApp a reliable group, or would call or phone or message their parents or their kids to verify if what they saw on social media was correct. It can also be institutional and incidental. If it just so happens that another publication or organization published the same thing, people use that as a heuristic to believe that this might be correct. Or it can be intentional. They go and Google the headline to check what others have written, or others say they would go to snopes.com or factcheck.org to actually check, verify the information. Someone said he would call the police or check with the government to verify information, which I thought was very, very active. So this is the framework, and by mapping these acts of authentication, we can spot where potentially the problem can lie. So, for example, if you look at external acts of verification, it's institutional and intentional, people can go and verify, Google the same headline, but we know how bots work now, where fake news producers would swarm the internet with the same piece of fake news. So if you Google the same headline, you're bound to find it reported somewhere else, also by another fake news website. So that might give the fake information some semblance of legitimacy if we can find it elsewhere. So, impact on journalism. This is Craig Silverman, the media editor of BuzzFeed, and he's done a lot of amazing work investigating fake news. This is one graph that he shared based on their analyses at BuzzFeed, where during the weeks leading to Election Day, engagement with fake news actually was much higher than engagement with mainstream news. So that is a worrying trend that I think journalism as a field should be concerned about. And indeed, journalism has responded, and this is a new study that we're currently running. We're looking at meta-journalistic discourse around fake news. How are traditional news organizations responding to fake news? And we're looking at editorials that made some comments made some sense out of fake news. So you see from New York Times, they're saying that big part of the responsibility rests with internet companies like Facebook and Google. Similar to The Guardian, they're saying Facebook wants to publish news and profit from it, but it does not want to act as a traditional news organization. So we're seeing blame being put on technological tech companies, but we're also seeing journalistic organizations trying to erect boundaries between what is journalism and that which is not, but is getting into acts of journalism and potentially facilitating the spread of fake news. But we also see another editorial from USA Today saying not too many readers are checking where their news is coming from. So again, also shifting some of the blame, rightfully I think, to audiences. And then you also have Chicago Tribune saying in their editorial, they give some tips on how audiences can address fake news, and one of the tips they give was relying on the mainstream media. So again, positioning journalism as the arbiter of truth, and erecting, again, boundaries to protect journalism as a field. So, in terms of the next steps, this was from a BuzzFeed memo written by Ben Smith that was leaked in December, distributed also in December. He was predicting in that memo that fake news will become more sophisticated and fake, ambiguous, and spun-up stories will spread widely. We've seen from Sharon's presentation yesterday how it's now so easy there's a software now to make someone look like he or she is saying something, and that can be potentially going to aggravate the problem we have with fake news. So in conclusion, these are just the things that I think we need to think about. We need to look at social media, rightfully, the role of technology, but at the same time we also need to look at users, audiences, not only of giving them options within, say, the technology that they use to be able to report and spot and stop Facebook from spreading, but also we have to look at them in terms of their literacy, of how much they can actually say which one is correct, which one is not, and what other interventions we can come up with. And finally, I think as a field, we need to reflect on what's our role in this issue. I think journalists are at a particularly good position to assert their role in the business of truth. And I think boundary work is more salient now, and there's something I'd love to talk to you when we have time after the presentation. Thank you.
So thank you, Edson, and big thank you to our three speakers for allowing us to peer into the minds of media consumers, understand their cognitive and decision-making processes, particularly when it comes to discerning fake news from authentic news. So I'm sure there's plenty of questions for our speakers today. Yes, Sharon, please.
Thanks to all the speakers, I learned a lot. This specific question is for Shyam. I got the impression that one of the things you're cautioning us against is an over-reliance on what we might call the security lens of looking at threats as through the lenses of anti-terrorism and so on. And there has been talk of a security industrial complex, for example, that may be distorting the way the world actually approaches the real problems we're facing. I wonder if you could elaborate on that point of how, I mean, if you agree, first of all, that it is a danger if we adopt too uncritically the security lens that is being offered to us by very powerful institutions. If you agree that that is a problem, number one. And secondly, what could journalists do better to look at these problems independently rather than through the eyes of security agencies and governments?
Sharon, could you repeat the first bit?
Oh, sorry. It had to do with where I got the impression that you were cautioning us against adopting a security lens through which we view the world's problems. Whether you agree with that and what we can do to avoid sort of securitizing the problems that we face.
Yeah, I would agree. I'd agree with that. I mean, the problem is beyond security. I was looking at it from a security practitioner. I was looking at it from that prism. I thought I should give another perspective. So far, we have heard from journalists and media practitioners. I was trying to combine both as a media practitioner. The danger of looking at everything from a security perspective is you often tend to miss the wood for the trees. I mean, you just look at, it's not purely security, it's anchored in social, cultural aspects of the country itself. I just alluded to it without diving deep into explaining the social, cultural fabric of the country, and I just started with 1948 with the assassination of Gandhi and how that the process of the Hindutva project, as they call it, which is essentially India for the Hindus, and everybody else, the Hindu way or the highway. And that's the project which is on right now. And we have to look at, it's very essential we look at all the social, cultural aspects which are creating this security problem. So it was, I would say to look at it purely from a security perspective would be very myopic. You will really not be able to resolve the problems, as it were. There's no such thing as a single root cause of terrorism per se. They're intertwined with many other aspects, I mean, of the country. And I think it's very important we be aware of the security dimension of the problem, but to resolve it would require a really interdisciplinary, a really intense effort at all levels of society. I don't know if that answers.
So on the note of an interdisciplinary perspective, I wanted to just ask Ullrich to actually comment and provide a psychological perspective on risk perceptions, particularly pertaining to issues of security.
I fully agree with what Shyam just said, that we need to look at this issue from a very, in front of a very complex background. The current post-truth malaise and the rise of Trump, and I'm not very familiar with the situation in India, but it sounds very similar on many levels, has been compared to the Weimar Republic in Germany before the Second World War. And being German, I know a little bit more about that than I know about the conflicts in India. And both in current United States as well as back then in Germany, there's massive problems at a societal level where there's inequality, and we need to look at those as well. It's not just a matter of attacking the fake news, but also trying to understand why people might be motivated to believe the propaganda. And if you look at countries with less social inequality and better education, then you see that fake news has a much harder time because people don't have the motivation to believe these things, right? They can make a decent living from honest work, and they're less motivated to, or don't have the need for someone being a leader telling them we're better than the others and it's them, and all this sort of scapegoating and pointing the finger just goes away because people don't have the psychological need for it. So I do think in my last slide I tried to convey this, that this is an interdisciplinary problem where we need to look at the societal root problems and not just look at the fake news and the misinformation. I used to think of misinformation as like a blemish on a mirror that you could go and wipe away, right? A blemish on the mirror of reality, so to speak, but I don't think that's the problem anymore. The mirror has become a window and an alternative reality. We need to think about why people need this window and what we can do about those core root problems as well.
If I may add, you're absolutely right. Even in India, it's compared to the Weimar. It's compared to the Nazis. And it's been going on for the last 20 years, the comparison. But I missed Sherian's second question, what should journalists be doing? And I think just as we train journalists to do business journalism, we need to be training journalists to be covering conflict and terrorism. The way conflicts and terrorism have been reported to a large degree, to say it's irresponsible is a very mild way of saying it sucks. The real problem is the focus often is on the sensational. It's more on the bang than the context. It's more on, there's very little effort to, and we as consumers, we see a headline, we see a gripping image, we see a tantalizing caption, and we walk away thinking we know everything we need to know about that particular conflict or that particular terrorist group or what they're fighting for or how the governments are opposing them or countering them. And I think we have got so attuned to looking at events as news without making an effort to contextualize it, to learn more about it. And yeah, we can say we are very busy, we don't have time to do all that. We just rely on newspapers to do their job of being balanced, fair, and credible. That's obviously not the case, which is why we're all here. We're talking about fake news. But I think the important thing about journalists covering situations like this, even what's happening in India, is forget the people who are partisans. I mean, they're not journalists, absolutely not. But those who really are making an effort, I know the challenges are many. There's intimidation by the government, by the government supporters. There are a tremendous amount of challenges for journalists working in situations like this, but which just means the responsibility is doubled for them. So.
Yes, please.
My name is Ari. I'm from Indonesia. My question is for Professor Ullrich Ecker. Yeah, you said that I get the impression that it's really hard to fight fake news because the people, society tend to believe fake news, even though there have been corrections and then there have been retractions. So the problem is, you said about one of your suggestions is that do not repeat the false information, do not repeat the fake news. But that's the thing. Like, I think this is practical questions for journalists. Like, let's say in the US, Trump said something that is wrong. Do we need to report that to the public or not? Because when the Trump said something that is not factual, and then all newspapers say so, even the correction, even the clarification itself is ineffective because people who read it will think, okay, this is probably Trump correct, and then the fake news is trying to distort, to disrupt. And also the fact that we now have social media, people actually get information more than one time. Like I get, okay, there's a fake news, and then you get it in your WhatsApp, and then you get it again on your computer, and then 2 days again, your other friends send you the same message. So I think is this a losing battle for us to fight fake news? The fact that you will always get fake news on a daily basis repeatedly, and there's no way you can do about it. Is that what are you trying to say? I mean, that's the impression that I get from your presentation. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. There is a risk if you do it poorly. So if you try and debunk the myths and you don't, pay attention to sort of the most effective techniques, you can do more damage than you do, have a benefit. So you need to do it carefully and think about the way you do it, and maybe look to research that people are doing in this field to say what's the most effective way of going about debunkings. And I think then, if you do it correctly, I wouldn't see it as a losing battle. It's a hard battle, it's an uphill battle, but it's one that you guys need to fight. Yeah? Because just mirroring Edson's thought that just ignoring the fake news may be contributing to the problem as well. But you need to do it. You need to try and do it better than just repeating the misinformation and saying, "Oh, it's not true." You need to find the best available evidence to make your case. You need to make sure you warn people before you repeat the misinformation. All those kind of things will help have more effective refutations. But sometimes, I agree, sometimes you probably best leave it alone if you know the person isn't going to listen to you, or if there's a big risk that it's something new that's popped up and you think many people wouldn't have heard it, right? And you debunking it will actually take it to people who haven't even heard it in the first place, where you're exposing them to misinformation that otherwise they wouldn't be. Those are sort of the boundary conditions where I think you can make it worse instead of making it better. Yeah, but I wouldn't be too pessimistic. Even though maybe my talk was a bit pessimistic, I think it's important to realize that it's not as easy as just saying it's not true, and that can cause harm, but that you need to sort of look into the research and what people in the field have to say about what are the best practices, right? And look, this is evolving as well. Yeah, so it changes, and you need to be, stay up to date with this kind of research.
Well, we're academics, so it's our job to be pessimistic. But I wanted to invite Edson to comment on this question as well, because clearly the survey respondents whom he studied do inhabit that sort of media environment which is highly saturated, where they're inundated with information from multiple platforms. So Edson, if you please.
Yep. I think it's a good question, and it's something I also encountered with one research that we did. We looked at Michelle Bachmann's comments on the link between HPV vaccine and autism, which is false based on science. But the dilemma for journalists was, would you report about that? And it's similar to I think what you asked. The ideal would be to not report about it. So you don't become complicit in spreading falsehoods. But I don't think that's tenable at this current media environment, where before, when journalists was just depending on the veracity that someone said something and not really on the veracity of what was said, that was fine because there were no other sources of information, and journalists had the monopoly of information. But now that's no longer tenable, because even if we don't report about it, people will have read about it from other sources. You would have read Trump's tweet. So I don't think we should, by not reporting about it, we're actually being complicit and not correcting it. So I think it's something that we need to reflect now as a field of disseminating truth now also entails correcting falsehood.
And if I can just briefly follow on from that, we also need to, as I said before, we need to see it as an interdisciplinary problem. It's not just correcting the misperceptions, it's also trying to expose the hidden agendas and the motivation that people have, discrediting those sources. But it goes beyond that. There needs to be, the IT guys need to step up, as a previous talker has said. We need to have more, automated fact-checking. Maybe we'll look back at the internet of today in 50 years' time and go, oh my God, this is what it was like? That's terrible, right? Maybe, we can change those things. And we need to acknowledge that sometimes just correcting people's misperceptions is maybe not the ideal approach. So, for example, designing information architectures that promote dissemination of true information and inhibits, dissemination of false information, and designing choice architectures that help make people make right decisions. Just an example, if you want to switch as a country from, you're worried about your organ donation rates, there's a lot of misinformation about organ donations, right? I've spoken to someone in the medical field who said, people are worried that they're going to take their kidneys out before they're dead and all those kind of things, right? A lot of misinformation out there, but challenging that misinformation is probably not the best way to go. The best way to go is change the whole system from an opt-in approach to an opt-out approach, right? That will change your organ donation rates from 5% to 95%. That's something you can never achieve with any kind of fact-checking or misinformation debunking that you ever do. So it needs to be a really broad approach to solve these kind of problems. So it can't just be the debunking. You need to do that properly, but there needs to be other things as well that come together.
again, from the context of counterterrorism, we keep talking about, okay, the terrorists are winning the information war. It's they've been up there much. They're nimble, they're quicker, they adapt to technologies faster than governments, and so on and so forth. And so all the time you hear in conversations like these that we need to step up on our counter-narrative. This is the terrorist narrative, and we need to really step up on our counter-narrative programs. And so top brains are hired, how to craft a message, how to be efficient, and so on and so forth. But the reality is, however much of counter-messaging you do, if it does not tally with the truth on the ground, it's a losing war for you. You can spend billions and billions of dollars in getting the best minds to craft a very nifty response to a narrative being put out by the terrorists. But if what you're countering, your messages, if they have no reality, I mean, not rooted in reality, if it's not based on, you say, okay, I'm going to talk to you about an example in 2002, when the Bush administration decided that they wanted the rest of the world to know that America is a safe place for Muslims. So they got the best brains from, what's that street from where they get all the advertising agencies? I forget the name. Madison Avenue, that's right. And they paid lots of bucks, and they produced 4 videos to be shown in countries with large Muslim populations. The targeted areas were Indonesia, Malaysia, I remember those 2. And it was called Shared Values. And the videos had 4 Muslim families in the United States coming up on TV and saying, what a great place this is, what a beautiful life we lead, we're treated equally, so on and so forth. Because when the videos were aired in these countries, people were rolling on the floor laughing. No, basically, because it was such a very crude effort. After having spent so many millions of dollars, of course, the lady lost her job after that. But the point is, you can say my message is slick and so on and so forth. But if the perception is that it's not true, then all your messaging, your counter messaging, is of no use. It has to be reflected on ground with ground reality. If it's not, no amount of counter messaging is going to work. And that goes back to the interdisciplinary, multicultural, multidisciplinary approach towards sorting out even a simple thing like a message.
So in the interest of time, we'll collect 3 last questions. There was a question in the middle. Yes, this lady, Junie, and this gentleman in front. Please.
Hi, I'm Deepal. My question is for Shyam. You talked about a counter-narrative, and like my question is in context of India, where you used the example of the human shield, the army. What happens is sometimes, like for everyone, for all of us journalists, fake news is a dilemma. But when it concerns issues of defense or security, debunking fake news or giving a counter-narrative often invites very strict action because, it could be deemed as against national interest. So I would want you to tell us if there are any forums or if there is any, because if I'm going to debunk that, yes, it was wrong, this was not used, just the human shield was not for, any national interest. It was just to identify and marginalize a minority. But if I'm going to put forth and debunk that government narrative, I could land up in a jail, which is under a clause which is a non-bailable offense. So in such circumstances, how do you really take, the issue of fake news forward when it's the government itself that's promoting it? Sure.
Junie, please. Oh.
I'm Chaitanya from Mumbai, India. The question, just to add to her, what is happening is right now what we call all the ministers in the government are graduating from the University of WhatsApp. So when I go onto the field to report and I come back in the evening, the chief minister of my province files more words than I do every day, right? So then how do we tackle this when it's not black and white fake to debunk, but it's the gray area where these government machinery is being very economical with the truth. So there's a gray area where things are put in a certain perspective and they just bypass the mainstream media. To give an example, Narendra Modi has 32 million followers on Twitter, and Times of India, the largest read English daily, has only 10 million. So these guys now don't need us, I think. So then in such a situation, what should young reporters like we do?
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on that point as well about chat groups, because University of WhatsApp and all that, we're talking about the various factors. And so the thing about social media, it's very open. So it's there for all of us to see. The danger really lies, I believe, in chat groups, because these are hidden from everyone. And I think that the propensity then to share very liberally without checking and all that, they just want to be first off the block, so it goes out the fastest. I think that's even more dangerous. The other thing I wanted to say was I really appreciate what Prof. Ecker mentioned about the how to sort of debunk this misinformation properly, debunk the source first as the fake source, and then after that, mention the myth, and then talk about the facts. I think that's really useful for us to write maybe posts. Of course, in headlines, we'll have to sort of reconsider how we do that and how we format our headlines maybe to reflect those elements there. But those, I think, really satisfy that the reader or the users need to have something to fill up the gap. I thought that was really useful for us, great takeaway. And then finally, I think Edson, the point on, I thought your talk title was the academic conference equivalent of clickbait, because it says what is, why fake news is maybe good for journalism, okay? But I have a question about the time spent, because previously, a lot of people would spend maybe 1 or 2 hours a day consuming media, watching the news on TV or reading newspapers. That time is now supplanted by social media, where we spend a lot more time catching up on what our friends are doing, even our high school friends from 30 years, 40 years ago, rather than actually reading news, which of course we lose that serendipitous factor, number one, and then the propensity for the echo chamber effect, number two. So I don't know, has any research been done on that? Thanks.
So, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, I'm John from the Philippine Daily Inquirer. If you'll allow me, let me ask 2 quick questions. The first is for Edson. It's definitional. Your definition of fake news starts off by saying they are news articles. Are they in fact news articles or just pretend news articles? I think there's a very big difference. I don't know if you agree with me. And then the second is for Ullrich. I don't know if you caught the keynote last night. It was terrific. Sharon actually asks us to think of fake news as a crisis of reason. It's in the Enlightenment Project gone awry. There's an assault on science, the institutions that offer authentication and so on and so forth. But based on your research, the psychology of misinformation, would you in fact agree that we are facing a crisis of reason, or this is just the way human beings think?
So if I could just invite Shyam first to address the question on institutional involvement in the peddling of fake news.
Yeah, I grant that Modi has very successfully created this climate of fear, hysteria, and retribution, and it becomes a very big challenge. But talking about national security and media's role, I think every country which has dealt with this problem of covering conflict and terrorism are aware that it's very easy for governments to clamp down on any negative news by saying that it comes under national security, so you can't report it. But the truth of the matter is, from a media perspective, we do become irresponsible if we are reporting, let's say, an ongoing operation For example, the Mumbai attacks was a case in point, where we were all over the place and we were actually relaying very critical and valuable information to the handlers who were directing this entire operation. So that clearly is a breach. I mean, that I would say is definitely a violation and it's dangerous. But the other aspect of this Kashmir pic photograph, it's not that most mainstream media did not report on it. They did report on it. For me, the bigger concern is, I think you can still get away with reporting these things in India now. The bigger concern is, and I think Modi's government is very aware of this, is because they have been so successful in pushing their cause with his million followers and all the bots that work for him. They don't seem to be overtly concerned what a small section of mainstream media is doing. Because from their perspective, they see this as a chatterity, the chatting class who are going to be looking at it, and it's not going to really matter to their constituency. So I think there's still space for journalists in India covering security issues to comment and to report, primarily because the man thinks he's very dismissive, he's contemptuous, that you're not going to make a difference to me. And that's the attitude. And I've not really seen so far any restraint on covering these issues in the Indian media as of now. So I don't know if that agrees, if that coincides with what your experience is. Chaitanya, your question about what to do, I wish I knew. I really don't. I mean, I can only think of one thing, which is use the tools they are using. Okay, you say Modi has so many million followers, and I think we all know pretty much that not all of them are human beings. There are bots and so on and so forth. I think it's something, I don't know, I'm just thinking aloud here. I think it's something we have to learn from the tools they're using and try to tailor them for our purposes as journalists. That's about the extent to which I'll go to give you some advice on what needs to be done, because I really don't have the answer for that.
I think Juni's point on social media and how the time spent, I think more than the time spent on using social media, we also need to look at the context surrounding the social media use. Often people use social media to complement another activity. If you're commuting or you're watching something else, there's research on second screening. So I think that aspect of news consumption in social media, it has implications on people's attitudes toward the news and also toward the source, which will affect how much they believed in it. For example, before, if you read a physical newspaper or you watch a TV newscast, you always see a hard news side by side another hard news. Now you see an important piece of news about, say, the situation in Marawi City in the Philippines, but that will be next to maybe a photo shared by your friend, or below it would be a cat video shared by the dog lovers page that you follow. So this news information placed side by side or juxtaposed with these other types of content also affect cognitive processes that can be triggered and can be activated when we process news, which I think will affect how much we believe, how much credibility we attach to the messages we see. So I think it's a valid point and something that will be exciting to also do more research about.
Okay, thanks for the questions. I'll respond to the easy one first, the one about titles and how to have accurate debunkings. Titles are really important, and it's up to the editors in the room to make sure that they actually choose the titles wisely. I've done some research where people read the exact same article, but if the title is misleading, it impairs people's memory for the articles, it impairs their reasoning, it makes them more worried about things they don't need to be worried about. So getting the headlines right is a really important thing to do. So the editors need to try and do that. Of course, they also know that putting spin on headlines works, which is exactly why they do it. But also there needs to be pressure on editors from journalists in general to get the headlines right. The debunking I showed was designed to be in 140 characters, so you can do this kind of thing very concisely. So I hope you get some encouragement from that it is possible to do these things concisely and to the point. The question regarding the crisis of reasoning, unfortunately I missed the head note because my plane was a bit delayed and then I was stuck in traffic coming in yesterday, but maybe I can watch it on Facebook let me know how to do that. Haven't been on Facebook in a year or so, but anyhow. Is it a crisis of reasoning? Look, reasoning has always been difficult, so I wouldn't call it a crisis of reasoning. I just think that the goalposts have shifted, the world has changed, and we're not very well equipped to deal with it yet, hopefully. So there have been, you know, there's so much things out there that people aren't aware of. If you ask the average person, they wouldn't be aware that there's tweet bots. If you ask the average person and you explain to them that there's a company called Cambridge Analytica that has data from millions and millions of Americans, used those data to specifically target the ones most susceptible to the propaganda in the lead up to the US election, they would be very surprised. So educating the public about those things will be very important, because it's important to know those things and have a healthy sense of skepticism towards what you read, and I hope the next generation will have more of that. But I do agree that there have been targeted strategic attacks on science and on evidence-based policy, and again, that's not a new thing. The tobacco industry has been doing that for decades. So again, it's not new, it's just at another level. It's been exacerbated and accelerated. So part of that problem is that people are now treating scientists as an elite, that they say they know stuff, and that's all just elitist. They're not, you know, we're not them and they're not us, and we should distrust them. And I think that's a terrible thing, and there is good evidence that, at least in some segments of the populace, trust in science has decreased, and I think as a community, not just a scientific community, but also anyone who's involved in science communication and communication of news events in general, we need to sort of work together to rebuild that trust, because we know as psychologists that trust is really a driving factor. It doesn't really matter how much of an expert you are. If people trust you, they will listen, and therefore it probably makes a difference if Leonardo DiCaprio comes on stage and says climate change is real. It will matter to many people. So we need to find ways in which we can rebuild trust in our institutions and in us as journalists and as activists on social media or wherever we are active in science and in communication in general, to rebuild that trust and you know, have a better conduit into people's reasoning. So crisis of reasoning, yes, but you know, we need to look at it in a very differentiated way.
So very quickly, for John's question on the definition of fake news, that was one of the definitions from one of the earliest academic studies on fake news. It's not my definition, but I have a paper coming up on digital journalism. It's a journal where we investigate the typology of definitions of fake news, which I can send to you once it's published.
Thank you. So I believe it's time for lunch, and that's not fake news. So nevertheless, let's first thank our wonderful panelists for providing us much food for thought.